My guest in the Nimataion today is BJ Swain, and together we're spinning a yarn. BJ, you're an author, magician, and it's great to have you here.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this.
What has been your favorite childhood story?
Well, I would say probably, well, I grew up in the 80s, so all stories were like magic stories and fantasy stories. That was just everything that
Yes.
was there when I was a kid. One of my favorites as a child was probably The Never Ending Story.
Mm.
The movie. I never ended up reading the book,
Mhm.
although I recently did get a copy a few years ago, so maybe someday. Um, but I would say aside from kind of the general, the world is magical and the world is fantastical, and being able to appreciate that, which I got from the Neverending Story and from a lot of the other stories and TV and movies that were on for kids at that time, because again, just everything
Yeah.
had magic in it.
Yes.
Uh,
Like today, isn't it?
yes, the things that were probably the biggest impact for me as far as stories as a child, my parents used to tuck me in at night, and they would sometimes read me the Bible and sometimes read me fairy tales, and usually kind of the violent, aggressive fairy tales where the magic was a little more real and present as well.
Mm.
Uh, but they would make up stories too, and my father knew that I really loved He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and so again, very 80s fantasy magic. And so he would make up these He-Man stories that featured my sister and I as characters, where we were secret superheroes who had a magical talisman that would grant us powers. And my character was this sort of child sorcerer who would go around and help the Masters of the Universe with their adventures without them knowing who I was. And so having that, I think, and having my father tell me these stories where I was this effective magician was probably very influential and formative. Like from as far back as I can remember, I wanted to be a magician, and used to, my parents would take me to wishing wells and stuff, and that's what I would wish for from as soon as I could talk. Um, but I think having that immersion where the idea of it and the fantasy and the wish and the hope were something that was kind of reinforced and accepted by a story that a parent was telling me was probably really useful.
Of course.
A bigger step in impact, though, and I wish I could remember the name of the book, the name of the story, uh, was around the time I was entering middle school. I read a story where a boy goes into a shop and he buys a book, or he finds a book at the library, and the book is a book of magic. And um, he it goes through talking about the spells that the boy would do. I remember there was one point where he and his friends were doing a spell, and they needed uh, hair from the beard of a red-headed man. So like the sort of thing that's like the weird kind of detail that you get in like grimoires and old magic books, where it's like, where do you find this? Like, how am I going to obtain this item of unobtainium? And so they end up getting the hair from the janitor, and I think that particular spell had to do with whatever the climax of the book was, because obviously they get this magic, but then it comes with problems and things they have to deal with, and they have to use the magic to resolve those things. Uh, but it was really interesting to me because the way the spells were laid out, it wasn't like what you see in a lot of fantasy books and fantasy movies where someone's just got a wand and they can zap energy bolts at things, or uh, they're just able to command things through the force of their will and the fact that they're just this really cool, powerful magician. These kids had to go through and collect things and put together spells with ingredients and actions and things that were like bizarre for them to have to obtain and to do. And it was magic that was a little bit more like what you see in fairy tales and folk tales. And as I got older, I realized that was also more like magic that you see in actual like historical magic books. But as a child, this was my first time realizing that you could go to a place that had books and maybe find magic books.
Mm.
And so this was a hugely important step in my life, because again, I was like maybe 11 or so. And so I started when I would go to the mall to spend time just hanging out with my dad during the weekends, I would always be like, "Hey, Dad, can we go to the bookstore?" And then I would kind of wander around the bookstore and wait till I thought he wasn't really paying attention, and then I'd drift over to the New Age or metaphysics or occult section, whatever they happen to call it in that bookstore. And I remember clearly standing in like a Walden Books routinely on the weekend, looking with excitement at all the different magic books that they had, and um, not realizing that my father was watching me. Because of course, when you're a kid, you don't realize how much your parents are actually paying attention. And eventually he came over and he said something about it and asked me if it was something I was interested in. And I kind of knew that he was interested in psychic awareness and astrology and things like that. What I didn't know at the time was that he had bought a magic book at one point and tried doing a spell to see if when my mother found the spell stuff, if she would be like, "Oh, that's cool," and get on board with it, and they could start doing magic together. And came to realize later that like both sides of my family had a lot of that stuff in them. My mother was not keen on the idea, so they did not do that. But and she threw away his magic book. But when he saw me looking at them, he wanted to be supportive, and he kind of asked me about it and started looking at books with me, and kind of would go through them, look to see if everything seemed safe and reasonable, and then eventually like bought me my first magic book when I was like 11 years old. Um, and it was book that wasn't very good because it was the early 90s, but it was what got me started as an actual person studying magic as opposed to just trying to explore it in the world with my instincts and intuition and from talking to spirits and stuff like that. And it started with reading a book that I got at the local library that told a story of a boy finding a magic book and going and getting weird ingredients like a redheaded man's beard hair and doing spells with his friends. And I think there's lots of stories that were around like that in the 80s and 90s of kids who stumbled on some kind of special magic thing. Like one that I really liked to remember reading was Eyes of Kid Midas, where a kid got magic sunglasses that basically made him omnipotent. Like anything he spoke into being would become real.
Hmm.
And it was a really exciting book, but it was kind of a silly premise. Like he's got magic sunglasses. But this one, it was just he's got a book and he can study and learn things and go through and find weird ingredients and do weird activities, and then magic happens. And to me, that just seemed so much more real and so much more like, wait a minute, that could be something that's out there. That could be something where I could go to a bookstore, I could go to a library, I could find things like that. And I think that was also like just like maybe a year or so after that was when some of the girls in my class at school started going through that phase of exploring and looking at magic stuff, and we'd all go to the library after school and kind of sneak into the occult section, and they'd be copying spells to hurt each other out of like Modern Witches spell book and books like that. And I remember somebody had scrawled a death spell in the back of their science textbook, and it was like the big kind of controversial thing amongst like a group of us in school was, oh, so and so has this death spell. And then I was like, oh, I better get a copy of it so that I have it and know what it is if like they're gonna have that knowledge. And so it was, I guess, like a good time for me to discover that book and realize that that was a way to gain that knowledge, because it was right at the age where kids start to do that.
Hmm. It reminds me of what Jeff Kruiper calls the book encounter.
Oh, okay. I don't think I've heard that reference before.
Yeah, this very destiny draws you to a certain book, and you immediately recognize it, not the book specifically, but that it has importance and it has meaning, and it will have an impact on your life. So that's exactly what you're telling right now.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the thing. And even the fact that it's not necessarily the book itself, but the meaning. It's like the book's kind of almost like this legend in my mind because I don't remember the name or the author. Or like I remember it was a hardback book. That's about all I remember, aside from the basics of the story and how it impacted me.
Mm.
So I do feel it was very important for me to find, and it was the right time for me to find it. And the message and the impact that I got from it were what I needed from it more than
Yeah.
the specifics of the book itself.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you talked about items. Do you still remember the talisman your father told you that would transform you into a superhero helping He-Man?
In the story, I think it was just kind of like a medallion. It was probably one of those things where like um the I think it was set up like the character based on me and the character based on my sister. We each had a special medallion, and we had when we had the medallions together and said the magic words, then we would be transformed into our alter egos and have the magical powers we needed to help. So
Yeah.
kind of fitting with the way things worked in the He-Man world, but also I guess very typical for those sorts of children's stories.
Mm. Did you ever obtain a medallion as a child to play it in the real world or something like that?
I had
In the
I guess
physical
early
world, rather.
yes, early on in experimenting with magic, I was kind of a kid that was like really into geology
Hmm.
and really liked studying geology, and I would go to the science store and look at all the geodes and the different rocks and minerals that they had available. And I think at like one of the science centers or something, I picked up a keychain that had a just a clear quartz crystal point. It was what was on the keychain, and when it fell off of the chain, I still carried it in my pocket. And one of the first like incantations or spells that I tried to do as a kid, and this was before I got my first magic books or before I read this story. This is the time I would sort of talk with like elementals and nature spirits and try to figure out magic stuff from interacting with those things in the world. And so eventually I started just like, okay, I'm going to try things that are just like focusing on what I want to have happen and saying incantations or words to try to describe it in a way that seems like a spell. And so I enchanted the crystal to be a crystal to kind of allow me to connect with magical things and to see through it, and kind of did like an instinctual, intuitive version of scrying with it, and would kind of carry the crystal in my pocket and would pull it out to like look into it and gaze into it to try to see things and understand things. And there were times as a little kid where it did seem to give me some like guidance or some insight into the kind of occult and supernatural things I was trying to explore. I was like 10 or 11, so I don't remember too much in the detail with that. But I also had a cross pendant that I similarly tried to enchant when I was like trying to figure out how to do all those things. And both the crystal and the pendant, uh, they would come loose from whatever held them, and I would drop them. And sometimes it would be really uncanny the ability to find them and have them turn back up. Like there was a time I was camping out in the woods and lost one of them in a field, and the next day was able to go back out to the field and like search through the kind of wild grass and find this little like maybe half an inch size pendant. Or times where like I'd lose it playing in my backyard or lose the crystal playing in my backyard, and then be able to find them days later, or just have them, just being a kid who couldn't keep track of things, have them seemingly disappear and be like, oh no, it's lost forever. And then it would turn up in ways that just seemed mysterious and unlikely frequently, much more than other things that I would lose did.
Yeah, I mean, every practitioner knows stories about how these items develop a mind of their own and wander
Yes.
off and yeah, or are being taken and whatever. So yeah, I recently heard an interview with you about familiars, and they are also they have to have some sort of resting place or where they a manifest peace for them, uh, and maybe there's a. I mean, could you trace it back to these childhood experiences or these stories?
Um, I think there's definitely room for similar things with that. The Cambridge Book of Magic has a spell in it for conjuring a spirit to bind into a crystal,
Yes.
so that you can use the crystal to view and interact with, and that's basically a conjuration for familiar spirit. Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft also has one for binding a spirit to a crystal in a way that is kind of like having a familiar spirit that you scry in a crystal to work with. So, yeah, I guess there is a similarity there.
Mm. Yeah. Wonderful. BJ, great insights into magical books, magical things, magical stories. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for being on the show, and I'm looking forward to talk with you again.
Thank you. It was really nice to be here.
Thank you. Bye bye. The world is magical.